Hi everyone, welcome back. It's Moya K, Swedish Whiskey Girl. Today we're doing a little bit of a different video, which is very exciting. We're doing a Zoom interview with Isabel Graham-Yooll from Whisky.auction. She's the whiskey director, and I think it got to be a really interesting chat. I don't know that much about auctions myself, so chatting to Isabel really kind of taught me a lot and made me kind of see auctions in a little bit of a different light. So I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. Here we go. But yeah, I thought we could just start with, who are you and how did you get to where you are today? Because I know I've seen a lot of information online that you've done quite a lot, it seems.
Yeah, well, I've been around for a while. That's part of the reason. So I started in drinks. I started with a part-time job at Oddbins, which in the good old days was a great place to learn about wines and spirits. I mean, it really was just a part-time job, and it really escalated from there. And eventually, I was working at Selfridges Wine and Spirits. I was managing the department there, and that was just at the point when people were taking more and more interest in spirits. And in fact, it was so I was there for the millennium, just as part-time. And really, that I remember that was the point when people just were beginning to drink champagne because they could, they think, I know it's a Tuesday, I'll drink champagne. That was a very different vibe to what had been there before. And the same was with vodkas. There were lots of new brands coming out. It wasn't just the same, it wasn't a choice between Smirnoff and the supermarket brands. Suddenly there were new ones, Belvedere and Grey Goose were turning up. And the same thing gradually happened with gin, but that came afterwards. And we had our range of whiskies, and you could pick up these things that now are several £1,000s, but you could pick them up for £80, and it seemed like a lot of money at the time. And at that point, Jeroboam's bought Milrose of Soho, and they had a large team of wine experts. I'd worked with them before, and they brought me in because I knew about spirits. Well, the truth is that I didn't know that much about spirits, but I knew a lot more than they knew. And so we all helped each other out. We sort of again escalated from there and became the spirits buyer there, BI Wines and Spirits, and then now running Whisky.auction.
Yeah, of course. And I just thought, I don't know if a lot of people know that, like, what does your role as auction director entail?
That's a good question. Okay, so it's the general sort of running of it and sweeping up as well. I think it's a bit of everything. I've got a team of whiskey guys and the team includes the importers, who are the first people. So when you deliver your whiskey to sell at auction, they receive your bottle and they inspect it, they check it's fit for sale, they check what it is, they input it, describe it in great detail for the auction. It then gets photographed by the photographer. Then I've got my my proofreaders. They then check, and this is just assuming that it's something that everyone recognizes. If it's something that someone has a question about, it gets then sent to someone else to check. We've got it's a whiskey auction, but it's there's a really high level of customer service as well. We look after every single one of our customers individually, as well as it all being automated. So there's a lot going on all the time, and I'm basically just hovering, flapping, causing trouble, making more work for people.
Lovely. I'm sure most people know this, but if you had to describe what an auction is with just a few words, what is an auction?
Okay, that's yeah, fair enough. Okay, there are different types of auction, and I'm not going to go into the whole what is an auction. I'll go into specifically what is an online specialist spirits auction. And in the past, you could buy wines and spirits at auction, and quite often there'd be a small local auction and someone, when they're emptying out their wine cellar, might have a vast selection of 11 bottles left in each case, so, things that they've tried and decided not to drink. And then there'd be a few spirits. But for a long time there wasn't any specialized spirits auction, and the big traditional auction houses have entered that market, but they're not specialists in the same way. Also, you had to turn up, and you might be able to do a telephone bid, but it's still, you're effectively turning up. An online auction allows you to. I mean, we're truly international. We are entirely global. People submit whiskies from all over the world, whiskies and spirits, and people buy all over the world. And they bid. I suppose if you've ever bid at eBay, the process is very similar. There's one difference. Well, there's a couple of differences, but the big difference is that we, as a company, inspect every bottle on behalf of the buyers and the sellers. So there's no direct contact with the buyer and the seller, which prevents there being any sort of fraud between them. We're the middleman, and we're the security that stops bad things happening.
It's like a quality check. Very much so.
Yeah, quality, and we verify the bidders, we verify the sellers, we verify the bottles. We're there to make sure that the process runs smoothly for the users, really.
And auction houses, of course, like yourselves, because you assist both buyers and sellers. And I was thinking, I'm sure that all of this information is on your website, but basically if you're a buyer, you keep your eye out for bottles online, and if you're a seller, you send them off to you. But is there anything you say that you would, any advice or any kind of think about this if you are to become a buyer or a seller?
So it's interesting. A lot of the time, buyers and sellers are the same people. So quite often, someone has bought lots of whiskey, their palate has changed, and they've moved on to other things. So it's more often than not, buyers and sellers are exactly the same people, and occasionally there's someone who's inherited some whiskey and they just need to sell it on, or someone who just buys at auction because they found that it's one of the best ways of making sure they get great whiskey, rare whiskies. They don't have to just choose from what's available at retail. Your question was, what should people know? Is that what should people know? I think okay. There are other auction houses out there. I would always be very careful to read what the terms and conditions are. That sounds really dull. Our website's very, very easy to navigate. It's really simple, and people can just phone up as well. We're kind of there Monday to Friday for a chat to discuss. I think you just want to make sure that the auction that you're buying from is inspecting the bottles carefully, that they have a track record in doing that. Not that they say they've got a track record. You can go on social media, and you were talking about the people you meet on Facebook and social media that around the whiskey enthusiasm. You can get a lot of feedback from there. I think really there's all sorts of tips in strategy that I could share. I mean, I can go in as much detail as you like, but there's all sorts of strategy of how to buy. In terms of selling, that's probably the simplest. It's just because just send them to us, and then we do everything for you. So that bit's easy. But when you're buying, do you bid early? Do you bid all the way through? Do you bid right at the end? That's something that's down to personal preference. It's kind of depends on your, and how much risk you want to take personally in whether you're going to get the bottle or not. Do you want to take it or leave it, or do you definitely want that bottle? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's kind of part of the charm, why people kind of get so intrigued by auctions, perhaps.
It's good fun. It's just, I think it's really good fun way of buying whiskey. It's also the most fun way of selling whiskey. And I've worked as a whiskey broker and buyer and seller before. And what's interesting is, like, when you're building a collection, I don't know, do you have a collection of whiskey?
Yes, an open one.
But that's the fun of it, isn't it? It's like, what's the next whiskey I'm going to buy? I remember buying this at the distillery. I remember buying this from this guy. This was recommended to me by this person. oh, I remember when we opened this, it was, that's really fun. That's the exciting part of building up your whiskey knowledge, building up your whiskey collection. Then when if you've been buying it to build up a complete collection, then it comes time to sell it. That's kind of, there's like, all you get after that is, I mean, it sounds a trite thing to say, but all you get at the end of that is money. You've built up this collection over years, months, years, decades, and then you're left with nothing. So if you sell at auction, that's the most fun way of selling it, because you go through, someone is there creating a photographic record of all your collection, describing it. You get all the excitement during the auction. It's a 10-day auction, and you get a flurry of activity on the first day. Then it sort of settles down, and then it really starts to sprint right at the end of the auction. And it's just so exciting watching all your collection. And we've got a feature where you can just watch it, like the money build up on your collection, and it is the most fun way to sell your whiskey collection.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's for me, because I don't have that much experience with auctions, but I'm quite intrigued by it. So it's really interesting talking to you and learning more about it. But for me, it's been a way to kind of keep an eye on things I might not see elsewhere, because I have a bit of a fascination for old whiskey bottles from the 70s or 80s, and you can usually kind of find a little hidden gem amongst the kind of lower priced ones that you can kind of steal away. And for Christmas, I also found one bottle for my boyfriend that I wouldn't have been able to find anywhere else, because it was a very limited edition and got a pretty decent price as well. So that's great. But I have a question.
You're right. So I was going to say, like, you've been looking out for 70s and 80s. That's just a great era to be picking things out for two reasons. There's some really overspec'd great whiskies from that era, and they don't seem to go for huge amounts. I mean, obviously some do, but now you can pick up really great blends from the late 70s and 80s for perfectly reasonable amounts. It's not, you always read in the press about these blockbuster, most expensive 100,000, 200,000 pound whiskies, but that's not the whole story. That's the press part of the story. What the exciting bit is picking up things that you wouldn't necessarily find otherwise.
Yeah, definitely. I think I got my bottle, which was I think a black bull from the 70s for £15. So I thought that was very reasonable.
Well done.
But I thought I'd ask about how you value, because I know you help customers value their whiskey. So is there any time you get a whiskey you've never valued before, and how do you go about valuing them? And
Yes. Okay, so the easiest, I mean, it's something that's that anyone can do for themselves. Actually, you just do a bit of research. So if you look on our auction and look at recent prices, you'll get a good and search for your bottle. You get a good indication of what your bottle might fetch. Then look at the trends. So has that price been really stable over a lot of months and years? Has it been increasing? Does it fluctuate a lot? And that's the sort of information you need. If it's with most bottles at this stage have appeared at auction already, so you will get some track record. If it hasn't appeared at auction, it may be because it's very new. So if it's still available at retail, then it's likely people will buy it at retail, so it can be worth waiting. But if it's something that hasn't turned up at auction before, that's where it becomes trickier. And obviously we do free valuations for anyone, so you don't have to do all this work for yourself. But if it's something that hasn't turned up at auction, we use our knowledge of the market to give an evaluation. We tend to be quite accurate. It's interesting. We give it in some cases we have to give a wider range, and sometimes we can be really quite pinpoint accurate on our valuations, because there's such a strong back sort of track record on them. But if it's something that we haven't seen before, we would look for similar items from similar eras. Also, our knowledge of, if it is tremendously rare, then obviously that's going to add value in itself. And we piece that all together, and we can give pre-valuations. We've got our valuer Scott, that's what he does. He just sits there valuing things, so he can pretty much do them from memory.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I also had a question here from one of my patrons, actually, Matthew. He'd like to know how often it's the same bottles that come through, because he's always wondered how much people are wanting to own bottles and show them off to then hopefully flip it for a profit versus those who have the means to really buy kind of rare and crazy stuff that they're enjoying. Because he's experienced that at whiskey auctions where he lives, the bourbon collectors try and squeeze money people for every dime, and then they still see the same bottles within a year or two, which he thinks is a bit disheartening. Do you see this as a problem, and is this something you come across a lot?
It's it's tricky. I think a lot of the time, from my experience, a lot of the time when people are buying at auction, they're buying because it's something they want to drink. Um, Obviously, you also get speculation. So if you're thinking that this bottle that's currently £100 is something that you believe is worth £300, then you're likely to want to bid on that. Then what you do with it afterwards, you know, if that keeps happening and you end up with a lot of them, then I can see why someone would put some of them back on the market. And then you have people whose knowledge of whiskey in the market is so strong that they'll use it as a way of funding their interest. So it gets to the point when you're buying whiskies for £2,000, £3,000 a piece. Now these people aren't rich, so they're using you do begin to see people using their knowledge to fund their hobby. What I think happens more often than you'd imagine is people's palates change. So people buy things and then change their minds, and that can happen very quickly. I mean, you can imagine it would happen maybe over 10, 20 years. But someone who's going on their whiskey journey, let's call it, and I don't know if you found it yourself, but the whiskies that you enjoyed when you were first taking an interest in the subject are not necessarily the ones that you would choose to drink now. You might just for nostalgia's sake, but actually what you're trying to explore is something very different. So if you'd bought whiskey a few years ago because, oh, I'll keep that for a rainy day, and actually, I'm never going to drink that. And so that would be something that you might, and I'm never going to drink that. And not only that, it's gone up to £500 and I bought it for 30. Yeah, that would be a perfectly understandable reason to put it back into the market. But as I mentioned earlier, I think buyers and sellers are often the same people. So yes, that does happen. People will be they'll have maybe £1,000 worth of whiskey in an auction, and you'll see that they'll be using that money to buy something else because actually I don't want those anymore. I want those. The question that Matthew asked is saying quite specific, and I know that is something that people do, but it's very difficult to know if you see a bottle turn up on the market that you think has been there before. It's difficult to know what the seller's motivation is just by looking at that bottle. So that it's not always, it doesn't always correlate that the one that you think is something greedy and untoward is so. But you do get people buying things and then selling them specifically for that reason. It's something that we discourage. So, for instance, what's often referred to as flipping, where someone buys something retail and puts it straight on the auction. We don't ban it because it's not illegal. It's not immoral either. It's just saying, but because we want the auction to have quite a broad and interesting range of whiskies, we don't stand outside distilleries on their open day saying, queue up, get your whiskey and sell it to us. That we're looking at slightly, we're looking at the big range, the big picture of what whiskey there is. The other thing is, I know that people buy things and then they buy them on an impulse and sometimes just change their minds. I have been known to buy things on impulse sometimes. So I get that too. There's so many different motivations, so many different reasons for selling, and usually there's fewer for buying.
Yeah, of course. No, I think it's an interesting one. I think it might be a preconception that a lot of people have that maybe aren't so knowledgeable about auctions and know what kind of people that are into auctions. Because speaking to you, I kind of get the impression that a lot of people that are into auctions, they have it as a hobby, and the strategy, and kind of like you say, they get rid of some bottles, but they also buy bottles to kind of keep the interest going, and they have a really big interest for whiskey. So yeah, it's nice to hear that, because I think a lot of people that I've been talking to about whiskey auctions that don't know that much, they kind of think that it's all about, you buy the bottles that are attractive on the market right now, and then you just sell them off for a lot higher to just make a profit. Which I think a lot of whiskey enthusiasts are quite sad about, of course. But
Yeah.
it's
I
nice
mean,
to
it
hear.
does happen. That's part of it. It's a buoyant market, so people will want to make money out of it. But it's often the people that complain about it the loudest that are doing it. So always be suspicious. Um, it's it's somehow it's something that people object to because it's frustrating. If you didn't get an allocation of a bottle and then you tried to get and then you see it at auction, then I can see that being really frustrating. But then there are so many whiskies. There's so many great whiskies, and it's not a human right to have every bottle that comes out. And
Yeah,
also, if you didn't apply for it, if you didn't apply to get the bottle in the first place, and then you see it again, it's like, how upset can you really be about that? Um, there are so many great whiskies, and look, the point you made earlier that you pick up 70s and 80s bottles. These are things that people have just had hanging around because they got given a bottle and then they were never going to drink it, but it stayed on the drinks cabinet for years and years and years. And actually, no, I'm just going to sell it now. There are so many reasons why people are buying and selling.
yeah, no, I definitely agree. I usually say that to people. They're like, "Oh, but it was a limited release. I really wanted it," and you're like, "Yeah, but there's gonna be others, and there's
Mm.
so many good ones out there, definitely." But I mean,
And also, just because it's limited doesn't mean that it's great. I mean, it's don't
yeah,
want to sound controversial here. And the whiskies that are often the most popular in our auction are whiskies that weren't limited when they were released. So some of the old Macallans that are hugely popular were things that were on general release. Some of the old blends, the really old blends, these were things that dominated the market. Think of some of the Johnny Walkers from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They dominated the market for decades. They weren't limited releases, but they're glorious whiskies, and all these blends that you pick up, and single malts from some of the supermarkets did releases just because it was easy to do it in the 80s and 90s. Those are now really valuable. They're things that you just wouldn't be able to get now
mm,
in the sort of volumes that they were available then.
yeah. Do you see any current kind of strong trend?
In auctions,
Mm,
um, there are all sorts of trends, and often there's trends that are conflicting, so they get strange results. It's been a buoyant time for whiskey auctions for some time. Um, there is more and more interest in old bottlings. I think when even 2 or 3 years ago, the conversations that I was having with people about, why would you buy this from the 60s when you can buy it for, when it's £300, when you can buy it for £30 just in the supermarket for the current release. That's a conversation that I'm probably having less often because people are getting more opportunities to try those old bottles and realize how different they are for a variety of reasons. It's auctions like ours, at whiskey.auction, anyone can bid. It's not exclusive. It's not that the retailers get to buy the bottles and then sell them to you. You're bidding there, whether you know a lot about whiskey or you know nothing about whiskey, you have equal right to bid on something, which means that you can very quickly, build up your palate knowledge and try all these amazing whiskies that possibly wouldn't have been available to you in the past because it would have been just more difficult to access those whiskies.
mm,
It's not just whiskey, rum, gin, classic gins, um, even vodkas, but all actually aged spirits. There's more and more interest in those. Uh, I think you can still pick up a great bargain from Armagnac, which is brilliant, and even some cognacs as well. It's again a similar sort of scenario. pick up a VSOP that was bottled maybe 40 years ago, and it's a completely different experience to what's being released now.
Are you a spirit drinker yourself?
Am I a spirit? Absolutely, yes.
Do you have a favorite spirit, or
Sorry?
do you have a favorite spirit? Or
Do I have a favourite? Well, it tends to be whiskey. I mean, if you're thinking of as a category, it will be whiskey. But then to narrow it down amongst those is tricky. I think I'm trying whiskies all the time, and having been a whiskey buyer in the past, I was trying all the new releases as they came out, and of course now I hardly try any of the new releases. But I'm trying, the entire back catalogue is I'm gradually catching up with it, with everything else that happened before, which is obviously a far, it's a vast subject. I like experiencing whiskey styles that I haven't tried before. It's there's always the great classics. There are whiskies that you get accustomed. The whiskey you'd use in your hot toddy is going to be slightly different to what you would wow your guests with when you want to show them something after a great meal. So I think there's pretty much a different whiskey for every circumstance.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
cognac too.
Yeah, no, I think if you like one type of spirits, I don't think it's too much of a step to step over to another one. And yeah, we're just getting to kind of explore more of cognacs and armagnacs. It's just, yeah, flavors just fascinating, I think.
So what brought you into whiskey?
Um, so my dad has a big whiskey interest, and he's been trying to get me into liking whiskey for years, but it's always just tasted too strong, and I've not really had any interest for it. But I moved to Edinburgh a few years ago to study, and then in my last year I met my boyfriend, and he was just starting a job in the whiskey industry. So he kind of brought home samples and told me all about them, and I'm quite nerdy, so I just like learning things about things. And then I was already kind of a big wine fan and had done some wine courses, so it was easy to kind of transport the interest for wine into whiskey, and then it
Definitely.
just kind of clicked.
And do you find that the more you learn about whiskey, that the more you realise there is to learn? I mean, it's like when you try your first whiskey, or your first you go attend your first tasting, suddenly you know a million times more than you did beforehand, and that sort of feels quite satisfying. Right, that's everything I really need to know. And then you start learning something, and it just becomes, the more you learn, the more there is to learn.
Yeah,
It's
definitely. It's yeah, you kind of learn what peat is, you learn what the oak influence is, but then you know that there's different chemical aspects of it, and you just want to learn that. So I think it is a really lovely kind of hobby to have, because it's just fascinating, and I'm really, really really grateful that I get to the opportunity to kind of speak to people within the whiskey industry and have a part in working in it. So yeah, it's definitely an amazing kind of chance.
Yeah, and I think trying, that any opportunity you get to compare some of the old whiskies to the new ones. So if you get a new release of something, or even if it's not, and I'm not specifically talking about limited releases, but I'm just saying, currently available whiskies. If you can try and get hold of an old bottling, and compare, it just blows your mind. I mean, it's just, and that doesn't stop. Just, and you 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 think it'll become predictable knowing the differences, and yet each one you try, there's something else that's different between the two. In doing vertical tastings, it's just superb.
Yeah, definitely. I had one question as well that I was really curious about, because I think Emily kind of sneak peeked this already. And I know auction houses like yourselves sometimes have issues with fraudsters.
Hmm.
And you had a particular one in 2017, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. We had a fellow who was submitting bottles, and we realised that they were that there were some fakes, and then we started looking in more detail, and everything that he submitted was problematic. And we became suspicious of him for that reason, and managed to prove that he'd actually been producing them himself, and got him arrested. So I mean, the amount of work that it took just to, 'cause you know, it's there are fakes on the market, but to actually find the person that's actually producing them and track them down and get them arrested was a great coup for us. We felt very pleased with ourselves in that one. But yeah, we're constantly on the lookout, and we're it's an ongoing challenge to track sort of fake bottles and fraudulent people. But
Mm.
we're quite aggressive on that front. So it's something we're quite confident on.
Do you come across it often, or?
I don't know what often would be. We every auction there are bottles that we reject. We have there are some very well-known fakes on the market that keep resurfacing. It doesn't matter how much you try and publicize.
Mm.
Or there's fakes that have been on the market since 2000, since the 90s, some that have been on the market since the 70s, and they do resurface because just because you publicized it then doesn't mean that someone that got caught out at the time didn't buy one and thinks it's pride of their collection. But there's also it's a strong market, so it will attract people
Mm.
that are naughty, and and they will try it on with whiskey auctions. And I think it's probably because in some cases it works. We like to think that once we've rejected things often enough, people realize that we're not the soft touch.
Mhm.
But does it happen often? It depends. I mean, we've got thousands of bottles coming through the auction every month, so it is a tiny proportion of that. But yes, it does happen.
Yeah, I see. And I know we're almost coming up to 40 minutes, and I'm stealing way too much of your time. But I have one last question, if that's all right.
Sure.
Um,
Well, what
what's the best thing and the worst thing about whiskey auctions, do you think?
so the best thing about using a whiskey auction is just the access you get to whiskies that you may not have had access to originally. We had a blog which was about the managers' drams, which were produced by managers at Diageo and pre Diageo, and they would do an in-house competition to see who could make the best one, and then that would be produced, and that was only available to staff. Now, you had no chance of getting those, but occasionally people retire, and this is something that helps them through their retirement. They sell them, and occasionally they crop up at auction. That's one example of the sort of things that you just wouldn't get a chance to try firsthand. Also, whiskies that maybe are only available from the distillery door, and if you particularly in times like now, but even before that, if you're on the other side of the world and you can't get hold of it, they do turn up at auction, and that's a great opportunity. It totally democratized access to whiskey. Worst thing, just the frustration of just missing out. I mean, the very worst thing that can happen to you at an auction is that you don't win the bottle. So in terms of how bad things can get, it's not the end of the world, but crikey, that's a very frustrating thing to happen, particularly if you're not paying attention at the end of the auction and you decided your tactic was going to bid right at the end of the auction, and you miss out, and it went for much lower than you would have paid for it yourself. That's probably the worst.
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, it's been great chatting to you. Thank you for taking the
Yeah,
time.
it's great to chat. Great to meet you.
And do you have anything else you would like to add or so before we hang up?
Do I have anything more to add? No, I think I suppose really I think whiskey auctions can seem intimidating, and I don't think they should seem intimidating. I think it's intimidating knowing that you're bidding against really experienced buyers. But that is not, you know, that doesn't mean that you're not going to win those items, and it doesn't mean that you're going to end up paying over the odds. You really are all on a level playing field, and that's, you know, it's just definitely worth a try.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I'm sure a lot of people that have been watching this have learned quite a lot, because I know I have, anyways.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel, and I hope
Thank
you
you very much.
have a lovely day.
And you.
Bye.
Bye.
And there you have it. I really enjoyed speaking to Isabel, so thank you once more, Isabel, for taking the time to chat to me. Yeah, like I said, I learned a lot, and it was really fascinating. I think speaking to any people within the whiskey industry and just whiskey enthusiasts that have a passion for what they're doing and the different aspects of the whiskey industry are really intriguing to me. So this is definitely one I haven't explored that much, but we'll look more into, see if I can find some good finds of those really old kind of 70s, 80s bottles perhaps. And of course, a massive thank you to Matthew, one of my wonderful patrons, who submitted a question for me to take to Isabel. It's of course really helpful to have your guys' approach, because then I kind of know what you want to hear, and if you are curious about more of these opportunities in the future and would like to submit questions to perhaps other interviews, then check out my Patreon. And of course, if you like what I'm doing here on YouTube and my other social channels, I would be eternally grateful if you would consider supporting me by perhaps checking out my affiliate links with either Master Malt, the Whisky Exchange, or the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. All those links and the information is in the link here below, as well as links to my other social channels if you're curious about that. As always, a massive thank you to my wonderful supporters through Patreon, and to all of you that are subscribing here on YouTube and perhaps following me on Instagram or checking out my blog. It really does mean a lot to me to have your support. But as always, I hope you've all had an absolutely wonderful day and that you enjoyed the video. Sláinte Skål.